Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this virtual fireside chat. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce my guest today, Michelle Kehily. Michelle is the global head for digital marketing and commercial excellence at Merck, a company she joined back in 2006. Over the years, she has held a wide variety of global, regional, and local roles in marketing, brand management, market access, and business unit leadership across multiple geographies, including Europe, Canada, and the Asia Pacific region. Prior to her current role, Michelle was global commercial leader for Merck's general medicine and neurosciences business. Michelle, welcome and many, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Sanjay. It's such a pleasure to be here.
The pleasure is entirely mine, and I'm so delighted that you could join us today. I'm sure our audience is really looking forward to the conversation that we are about to have. And so let me kick this off by kind of opening it up with a very broad question. And it's a question that's on my mind, and I'm sure it's on the minds of several people. Uh, so you've been at the forefront of redefining how Merck engages with its external stakeholders, HCPs, patients, etc., mainly from a commercial standpoint and marketing standpoint, and in embedding, shall we say, the concept of agile marketing across the organization. So before we get into the details of what agile marketing, et cetera, is at a very high level, can you at least demystify for us what agile marketing is? Because so much is written and said about it, but it's not very clear sometimes.
Thank you, Sanjay. And again, I'm so delighted to be here and have the opportunity to talk about this. It really is one of my favorite subjects. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to demystify, as you say, the concept of agile marketing, which is not a new concept. Agile as a concept has been around for, I think, decades now. But more recently, the question has been asked, how can agile practices be applied to the way that we conduct marketing and strategic planning within life sciences businesses? And I think at the heart of it, if you think about just dropping the terminology of agile, at the heart of it, this is really about accepting that our marketplace and our ecosystem, our environment is changing all of the time. The speed of change, increases. And in order to be ready for that, then it's just not good enough to build a plan once a year. We have to continuously think about and readdress our strategic choices, our execution choices. We've got to use data to do that, and it has to be a continuous and live process if we want to maintain relevance and add value to the ecosystem that we're operating in.
Oh, that's helpful. So to craft it like that, so maybe we can, talk a little bit about the journey itself, right? How and when did you embark on this journey towards agile marketing or embedding agile processes in the marketing of some life sciences products, etc. So, how did it start? Do you start with a few proofs of concept, see how it worked, prove the model, and then go all in, or was it pretty much like a, shall we say, a well thought out strategy, and then you had a big bang approach to kind of go after this revised approach of marketing? And when I say revised, it may not be revised in Merck because it's been there for a while, but in general, when I frame it in the context of the industry overall.
So I guess the way I would answer that is maybe with a bit more of a general comment first, which is around how I think transformation happens in organizations. And typically you will see, if you look out across the organization, if you scan any large company or even small company, you will find pioneers. You'll find innovators who
Yeah.
are, really working to address the changes that we see in our environment. So I think most innovation and transformation in companies has to start with those pioneers.
Hmm.
And then at a certain point, it has to become more of a top-down effort if it's actually going to scale. But the starting point is in the space of innovators in the organization, that's where the proof points come first. Um, and that's also where the excitement and the energy comes from. And that's when you start to see some momentum. There is a tipping point, and we've been through, I mean, the journey that we've been through, I think, follows that broad pattern. And then there's a tipping point where you say, is it enough that there are innovators in corners of our organization doing something? And what of that they're doing, what can be applied actually more broadly and at scale? And that's a hard step to take, because in large organizations, the complexity of getting things done and the complexity of change management is very real. I think as it relates to agile, it's not about embedding agile methodology as such. It's about taking principles of agile and asking of these principles which are the ones that we think can make sense
Mhm.
in the way that we build our marketing models.
Got it. And for someone who's thinking of embarking on the journey or embracing agile, so to speak, in their organizations, uh, are there any pointers about, you mentioned obviously you want to start with something, create belief in the organization so that even top down people are kind of, uh, shall we say, incentivized to drive that change across the organization. But it's crucial that the first few pilots that you pick or proofs of concept that you pick are ones which are, to some extent at least, where the odds are stacked in favor of at least being able to evaluate a positive outcome or arrive at a positive outcome. So, are there certain attributes of the kinds of pilots or proofs of concept that one might kind of think about when one is kind of thinking about which products or markets or methodologies or types of campaigns one should pick?
Hmm. Well, I think it starts with the leadership. So, the types of leaders usually who want to embark on these kinds of experiments um, are usually those who are most comfortable with experimentation, and I think that has to be the case. So, the groundwork of psychological safety as we go on these journeys is really important, because actually it's very likely that the very first time that any given team starts to adopt agile practices, it's likely to probably not work perfectly, quite frankly,
Hmm.
because we're asking for teams to work in different ways. So we ask for teams to come together, to collaborate, to take off their kind of functional hats, to get really transparent about the work, to stretch the team's aspiration in terms of what the objectives are, to be kind of like radically transparent about when we don't meet those objectives, and dig into the reasons why, and to have the kind of safety in the team to be able to do that. So all of those things are kind of a combination of the culture that a particular leader or leadership team will drive. So I think that's probably the most important secret sauce in terms of like choosing where to go first. But also I think we find that these are also the same people who will put up their hands and say, we want to do something. So, it actually naturally that sort of tends to happen anyway.
So that's really insightful and useful, because what I'm hearing you say essentially is that, yeah, sure, you want to pick the right kind of product or the right kind of campaign, etc. But at the end of the day, it's ultimately about the leadership and the people who are going to be part of it, so that they ought to be willing to say, all right, I know that this is an uncertain path, and therefore I'm willing to kind of deal with some of the rockiness that comes with this road itself. And once you get that right, then hopefully you will get some success. So let me kind of unpack a little more about that. Right, one of the things we think about when we talk about agile, and you've kind of alluded to this in the previous comment that you made, is about bringing a team together, and typically it's more cross-functional, right? And
Mhm.
that is, to some extent, different from the siloed nature of how pharma was structured in the past. Uh, and can you kind of at least highlight from a marketing perspective, if there was a marketing campaign, let's say targeted at physicians, etc., what kinds of functions do you need to bring together? And in that, you know, how does one kind of remove some of the friction that has traditionally been there between, let's say, marketing and medical, or marketing and IT, uh, and data analytics sitting in some silo, etc.?
Yes, no, exactly. That's a spot on. I think observation and question. When we think about the ways in which marketing has changed over the years, you sort of sometimes wonder whether marketing is even the right term to use, because ultimately we're in this to get to better outcomes for patients, as broadly as possible. And in order to do that, then we have to think about a whole healthcare ecosystem. So ecosystem thinking or systems thinking is, it's the place to start. Like thinking about the whole environment, thinking about all of the influencers. And then when we think about all the influencers in the environment and how we're going to get to these broader patient outcomes, then automatically you start to think, well, it's access and policy and medical and all those other areas that are going to drive key leverage points within that ecosystem. So I think the people in the room have to be reflective of the system that we are working within. And it's really only then that we can have the kind of caliber of conversation that gets us to something that really goes beyond promoting,
Mm-hmm.
messages to individual prescribers, but something that's much more meaningful, and thinks about all of our audiences.
And so, just kind of putting a little bit more of my operational hat here and I thinking a little bit about what you said at the very start about an agile approach, which is about being not necessarily having a plan that starts at the beginning of the year and then just continuing down that plan, looking at the data and actually responding to it. So that, at the end of the day, is really a, a huge lock that needs to be opened in terms of how one unlocks the value of data, but in near real time, right? So how have you done that? Is that primarily because of technology and AI that you've been able to do that, or is it just basically bringing the analytics folks into that agile pod, so to speak, and then getting them to inform in near real time? Because otherwise, a lot of what we do is really looking into the rearview mirror, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think there are a lot of different levels in answering that question. And I'm not sure, quite frankly, that we've cracked this at scale either. I think we're on the same journey that many of our peers are, and even outside of pharma and biotech, even in other industries that have claimed to kind of have cracked this. When you kind of take a peek under the details of that, you see that actually that's usually not the case, because it's hard. But I think there are, very often we get very, quite hung up on the technology or the actual data itself. And we have to, build that infrastructure, if you like, or we have to create those systems within a company. But the harder change, in my experience, is actually, what do people do with this technology, or what do people do with this data? You can have a phenomenal, data scientist on your cross-functional team. That
Mm-hmm.
doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to make different decisions if you don't know what the right questions are to ask as a marketer. And if you're not asking questions based on, well, what am I going to do differently when I know the answer to this question, then it becomes sort of moot whether we have data or not. So, I'm all about thinking about the changes in the actual team who are driving those decisions. What are the different questions that team are going to ask? And, and then when we have the answer, what are the different actions that we're going to take? Because, if we're doing kind of the same old thing, but now we have a data scientist in the room, then that's really kind of not the point. So that's a long way of saying the change management from a marketer point of view is significant. But at the same time, I do think the awareness now across, even in our industry, which tends to lag a little bit, is so high on the, how essential it is to build out these capabilities.
Got it. And, given how much of this entire summit also has focused on it, how much we as a company actually focus on it as well, has the agile approach also had an impact on the way you think about how content is developed and produced and repurposed in order to kind of be relevant for the different campaigns or for being more responsive to the data that you're producing? So how has the content supply chain actually gotten impacted by the fact that you're adopting an agile approach to stakeholder engagement?
Yes, that's a good question. So, in my opinion, the closer to the customer the tactical execution is, then the more applicable is agile methodology. So, kind of like full agile methodology, be it Scrum or whatever it is that the organization is choosing to deploy. Um, and that's because content these days is moves at great speed and volume. We have to be data driven in our approaches around a promotion and how we're creating relevance for our customers. So I think it's one of those areas, if you think about sort of the value chain of work, from what I call capital S strategy that happens sort of on a longer cycle, to small s strategy, which is, in the way that I see it at least, the decisions that we make much more frequently around our customers. Then I think the closer you get to small s and the closer you get to customer, then the more needed it is that we are coming together in that multifunctional squad, assessing our data in as real time as possible, or if that's automated, which a lot of companies now use automated approaches to make those decisions. That's a great example of what good looks like. Then that's where, if I was starting somewhere, that's probably where I would start.
Got it. And you talked about the change management, and I guess there's a question from the audience as well about what is the biggest challenge when it comes to being agile in marketing. So I'm assuming that it's alluding a little bit to the change management approach, and you talked about the marketer having to kind of think differently as well, be much more willing to look at the data for what it's telling you rather than just using whatever experiential knowledge that he or she may have. But at the same time, I want to kind of add to that question, apart from how you have seen the role of the marketer as well as uh, the philosophy of the marketer changing. How do you think this approach has even impacted what you're asking for your agencies to do for you? So has that kind of had an impact on what your expectations of the agency and the role of the agency is?
Yes, definitely. So if I sort of unpack the questions, just starting with the challenge piece, embedded in the change management is the fact that many brand teams still today are assigned a budget on an annual basis, right? And so to move from this cadence of thinking about, what did I have last year, and now I've got this year, and here are all my plans, and this is what I'm going to do, to something that's much more zero based, that is continuously evaluated, and where there is transparency on, what is working and not working with this investment, is, a very big change for most marketing teams. And
Of
I would
course.
say that is probably the number one challenge from a change perspective. Um, then, so in your follow-on questions on the agency front, so here, you've got to have great partners, and we see our agency partners as critical enablers of the change that we want to drive at scale. Because if you're not hand in hand, lockstep on what are the principles of our marketing model across this company with your most important partners, then it's going to be very difficult to actually lead at scale change.
So, when you adopted that approach, was there a significant amount of effort that you, as the client, so to speak, had to do to onboard your partners to kind of say this is the approach, so kind of restructure how you deliver the services to us, as well as perhaps your operating model for working with Merck, for instance? And is that how it typically worked, or did you go out and say which agencies already have an agile approach?
It's an area where, again, I think we're not quite there yet, but over time, I would say in the last few years, we've become a lot clearer in our partnership conversations and transparent about what are the changes that we want to drive, and then what are the clear expectations on what that's going to take from a partnership front. But that's been, again, it's been a little bit of a journey because we're on a journey, so we're learning what do we need. Most of the agency partners are on the same journey, like trying to figure out how to pull together multidisciplinary or cross-functional teams from across different agencies to solve problems, to move faster. I mean, it's a similar challenge, I mean, particularly at scale. So I think there needs to be a little bit of patience. There needs to be a lot of dialogue, and there needs to be a lot of transparency in the communication to actually get there. And there has to be a strategic agreement that's probably going to go over years
Mhm.
to really get there, because you cannot switch these things on overnight. So I think you've just got to have that acceptance going into it that this is going to be a shared roadmap.
And getting into going towards the measurement of the outcomes, for instance, right? Obviously, there are operational metrics of how quickly you could do stuff and everything, but at the end of the day, we're doing this because we're we're expecting that we will be much more responsive to our external stakeholders, patients or doctors, etc. We're here to service their needs, and if we're able to do that in a responsive and an agile manner, chances are that they will engage better with us or more with us, or start kind of relying on us for more services and products. Uh, while you're doing this, as a person who's kind of leading this effort across the organization, looking at digital marketing excellence overall, uh, are there certain surrogate markers you look at in terms of KPIs or metrics to say, all right, I know that we're on the right path? Because the outcome, the business outcome for the company may be a lagging indicator, but there may be some leading indicators that will tell you that, yes, you are moving the needle in terms of NPS or customer engagement, etc. What are some of those indicators that you would recommend people look at?
Yeah, I mean, I think the indicators are signals. I would call, I tend to see metrics as being signals as opposed to hard metrics for the most part. You mentioned, measuring internal metrics is a lot easier, right? Obviously, than understanding impact to customer. Very easy to understand kind of operational internal metrics. Quite hard to build metrics where you can create attribution. We did this and then this happened. That's quite challenging.
Sure.
But at the same time, I think, generally, you mentioned NPS, measures around customer experience are important. And then some of the kind of classic engagement types of scores that people use are interesting kind of indicators of what's working, what isn't working. But ultimately, you want to be able to create better. We know we're on a journey to create better attribution and to be able to really understand the customer journey from end to end. I think the dream state would be to be able to do that from a global, regional, and local lens. I mean, I think our markets are obviously much closer to customer than global headquarters is, and are really much more expert in terms of understanding what a customer needs. But at the same time, we need to move to a place where we have better visibility across the whole chain of activities to be able to make better kind of enterprise wide decisions too.
Good. And given the theme of the summit, we've talked about scaling innovation, scaling practices, and scaling them now. But I'm going to break that up into two parts. So one is obviously a question that I want to kind of pick up from the chat. Somebody has posted a question about how does one start this? Did you is it better to start working in smaller teams first, just a single brand or a single region, etc., and then scaling it? And I think to some extent it is similar to the question I asked at the very beginning as to how do you pick your proofs of concept or pilots. But is it better to kind of start with a smaller brand and perhaps a smaller region so that it's all much more tightly contained? And the follow up, or part B of the question I have, is that uh, given a company like Merck or several other companies that are like Merck, which are truly global in nature, right? It may be possible for you to get this done for a brand in a particular geography, but what has your experience been in terms of taking this truly global across markets? Because the dynamics would be different, even their market requirements may be different, and their customers are very different. So two-part question, and I think we just have a few minutes left, and that would probably be the last one before I give you the final word.
So on the first one, which is where to start, I think there is definitely something to be said for starting small. So I think with any change journey, you've got to think big and act small, and then kind of move from there. Having said that, I think with the right sponsorship, I see no reason why it wouldn't be your biggest brand in your biggest market if you've got the right team and the right sponsorship behind it, quite frankly. So a lot of things we do, we find, yes, it's easier to engage, it's easier to get things done in a sort of small market environment. But as I said kind of earlier in our chat, to me, the most important attribute is the leadership enthusiasm to go on this journey, and the climate of the organization to be able to actually make that work, both in terms of, as I'd mentioned, the psychological safety component, but also the willingness to be transparent on the outcome, which is sometimes very hard to do in a big company. And then the second part, which is how do you go from great experiments to at scale? I mean, this is the big question of the day. And I think it has to be, so there's a point where bottom up and innovation in small spaces is just not enough. So top down
Mhm.
sponsorship is a must. I mean, if you really want to scale across the world, across the enterprise, it has to be with top down sponsorship. And then it's a question of getting leaders really engaged in, like, what is this anyway? So I think the role for anyone who's leading change, the role to socialize the people who make those decisions, to socialize the concept, to go and see other companies and how they work, to kind of really grasp what this change is. That is a fundamental part of driving that change from the point of view of a person who's operating in the headquarters environment. Because without that sponsorship, you may go from 0 to 1 or 1 to 3, but you're not going to go from 3 to 8 out of 10.
Understood. And I'm assuming that when you talk about taking it means also taking it to other geographies because the same
Yeah.
approach would be equally effective. It's not as if it's a US centric approach that works, doesn't work elsewhere. It actually is an approach that can be truly uh, global
Oh,
in that.
100%. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Wonderful. No, so I think we're almost at the end of time, and Michelle, I really do want to thank you, but I'm going to let you, give any parting words to our audience as to what they may want to keep in mind, if any, about any pitfalls if they were to go down that road. But yeah, so any
Well, I
parting
think
thoughts?
it's, just picking up on, I guess, a couple of things. So this concept of think big, act small, that's one. And then the other is, I wouldn't get too hung up on the agile methodology as such. Pick the key principles that you think are right for your business, for your company. Be it like, improving the cadence of making decisions, embedding more data into decision making, having different people in the room. Pick some of those principles that are going to be applicable, maybe not even call it agile, and start from there.
No, that is extremely useful advice. Otherwise, we'd get too caught up in the semantics and what is considered the flavor of the day. But what I'm picking up from you, and I think what the audience ought to have picked up during the course of this conversation, really, at the end of the day, it's about uh, picking the right thing, but then at the end of the day, not being scared of the journey moving forward. And that means the leadership needs to put their weight behind it. And once you've got that going, then chances are that you will come out of the other end very successful, having ironed out all the kinks. Michelle, we're completely out of time, and there might be several questions. This is a conversation that can go on and on and on, but it's been truly helpful. And thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us today. I'm hoping that the rest of the audience enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. And I wish you all the very best. I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit and have a wonderful day. Thank
Thank you,
you.
Sandra.
Thanks, Michelle.